What happens when a man's grief becomes so sharp it can shatter stone? What happens when the silence he screams into answers back, not with anger, but with a love so profound it breaks him all over again? But this time, it breaks him open. This is the story of Elias Vance, a man who declared war on heaven and found himself met not with thunder, but with a whisper of forgiveness he never thought he needed. He hammered his rage against a statue of the Virgin Mary, and in the ruins of his own making, he received a message that would not only rebuild him, but an entire town along with him. Elias Vance was a man carved from the rock of his own sorrow. The town of Havenwood remembered him differently, of course. They remembered him as the man who loved Maria with a ferocity that was the envy of every husband and the dream of every wife. He was a builder, a man whose hands were calloused and capable, hands that had built the home they shared, the garden shelves where she grew her herbs, the very foundations of their life together. His faith, back then, had been like his work, solid, practical, and built to last. He believed in a God of order, a God who rewarded hard work and a good heart. Then Maria had gotten sick. The illness was a thief, slow and cruel. It stole the light from her eyes, the strength from her limbs, and finally, the breath from her lungs. Elias fought it with everything he had. He poured their savings into doctors in faraway cities. He read obscure medical journals until his eyes burned, and he prayed. He prayed with the desperate intensity of a drowning man begging for air. He knelt beside her bed, his large hands holding her frail ones, and made promises to a silent heaven. He promised anything, everything, for just a little more time. Heaven, it seemed, was not listening. After she was gone, the faith that had been his bedrock crumbled into dust. The God of order became a God of chaos and cruel indifference. The church, once a place of comfort, felt like a monument to a lie. His neighbors, with their well-meaning casseroles and whispered condolences, became sources of irritation. Their pity felt like sandpaper on his raw soul. He sealed himself inside the house he had built for her, a fortress of memory and bitterness. The silence in that house was a living thing. It was thick with her absence, echoing with the ghost of her laughter. Elias moved through the rooms like a phantom, the world outside his windows fading to a gray blur. His grief was no longer a quiet ache. It had metastasized into a cold, hard anger. It was an anger that needed a target, a focal point for all the senseless pain that churned inside him. He found it in the grotto. At the edge of town, nestled under the gnarled branches of an ancient oak tree, stood a small statue of the Virgin Mary. It was old, neglected, the blue paint of its mantle peeling away to reveal the stark, white stone beneath. Rain and time had worn its features smooth, giving its face an expression of perpetual, gentle sorrow. It was the place Maria had loved most. She would go there in the evenings, leaving small bouquets of wildflowers at its base. She said she found peace there, a quiet communion. For Elias, the statue became the face of his unanswered prayers. It was the serene, silent witness to his wife's suffering. It was the symbol of a faith that had offered comfort, but no rescue. He began to hate it with a passion that startled even him. He saw its gentle expression not as compassionate, but as mocking. It was the placid face of a deaf deity, a mother who had watched his Maria fade away and had done nothing. The town of Havenwood itself seemed to share in this quiet decay. It was a place where young people left and old people stayed, where storefronts were empty and stories were long. The faith of the town was like the paint on the statue, weathered, faded, a relic of a more vibrant time. People still went to church on Sunday, but their movements were more habit than devotion. The spiritual heart of the community was faint, a flickering candle in a strong wind. The neglected statue was a perfect metaphor for the town's own neglected soul. Elias's private despair was just a more acute version of the town's quiet resignation. He was not an anomaly. He was simply the first to break. The second anniversary of Maria's passing arrived on a gray, suffocatingly humid day. For 2 years, Elias had kept his rage contained, a furnace burning deep within him. But that day, the furnace door blew open. He spent the afternoon with a bottle of cheap whiskey, each sip stoking the flames of his memory and his fury. He remembered Maria's hands, how they had trembled near the end. He remembered her voice, a thready whisper asking him not to be sad. As dusk settled, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, a storm of emotion propelled him out of his house. He didn't know where he was going, but his feet knew the way. They carried him down the familiar path, through the tall grass, to the clearing with the old oak tree. There it stood, the statue. In the fading light, its sorrowful face seemed to look right through him. All the pain, all the futility, all the unanswered questions of the past 2 years coalesced into a single, unbearable point of pressure inside his chest. "Why?" he roared, the sound tearing from his throat, raw and broken. The whiskey slurred his words, but not the agony behind them. "You just watched. You did nothing. She prayed to you. She brought you flowers. And you did nothing." His voice cracked. He was shouting at a piece of stone, and the absurdity of it only fueled his rage. He looked around wildly, his eyes landing on a heavy, jagged rock half buried in the dirt nearby. He wrenched it free. It felt heavy and real in his hands, a solid answer to the formless void of his grief. He lifted the rock high above his head, his muscles screaming with the effort. For a moment, he saw Maria's face in his mind, her eyes wide with sadness. He hesitated. Then he thought of her last, labored breaths, and the hesitation vanished, burned away by the white-hot fire of his pain. He brought the rock down. The sound of stone striking stone was shockingly loud in the twilight quiet. A sharp crack, like a bone breaking. He struck it again, and again, aiming for the serene face, the outstretched hands. Chips of white stone flew like shrapnel. He didn't stop until his arms gave out, until he was gasping for breath, the rock falling from his nerveless fingers. He stood there, panting, staring at his work. The statue was ruined. The face was a brutal scar of crushed stone. One of the hands was completely gone, shattered into a dozen pieces. He had done it. He had finally made the world outside reflect the ruin he felt inside. He felt no triumph, no release. Only a vast, chilling emptiness. He turned and stumbled back into the darkness, leaving the desecrated icon behind him. The next morning, the sun rose on a town that was about to be shaken from its long slumber. It was Sister Agnes who found it, a small, bird-like woman whose gentle presence was one of Havenwood's few remaining constants. She had tended the grotto for 50 years, long after most had forgotten it. She saw the destruction and her hand flew to her mouth, but she did not cry out. She simply knelt, her old knees protesting on the hard ground, and began to gather the larger fragments. Word traveled through Havenwood the way it always did. A quiet phone call, a hushed conversation over a garden fence. There was no doubt who had done it. Elias Vance's rage was a poorly kept secret. The town's reaction was not anger, but a deep, collective sigh of sorrow. They saw the act for what it was, the final, desperate cry of a broken man. They didn't condemn him. They withdrew from him. The space around him grew wider, the silence deeper. He was no longer just the grieving husband. He was the man who had smashed the Virgin. He was an outcast in a town of quiet believers. It was that same afternoon that little Sarah Miller, the 7-year-old daughter of the town baker, collapsed in her yard. A fever bloomed in her with terrifying speed, leaving her delirious and unresponsive. Dr. Evans, a man of science and little patience for what he called local superstitions, was stumped. He ran every test he could. There was no infection, no virus he could identify. The fever simply raged, consuming the child's strength, and nothing he did could bring it down. The timing did not go unnoticed. A child falls gravely ill on the same day the town's sacred symbol is destroyed. Whispers started to connect the two events. It wasn't logical, it wasn't rational, but in a town where faith was a dormant seed, the violent act had shaken the ground. Fear began to sprout. They looked at Elias Vance's house with a new kind of dread. His personal tragedy had now, somehow, become theirs. Elias heard the news about Sarah through the grapevine of silence. He overheard it at the general store, the words dropping into the air like stones. A part of him, the rational, angry part, scoffed. It was a coincidence. A tragic, terrible coincidence. But another part of him, a part he didn't know existed, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The world, which he had tried to reduce to a meaningless chaos, was suddenly hinting at a terrible and unseen order. An order in which his act of rage had consequences beyond broken stone. He locked himself away, the town's silent judgment pressing in on him from all sides. The whiskey offered no comfort anymore. It only sharpened the edges of his guilt. He didn't feel guilty for breaking the statue. He felt a deeper, more profound guilt he couldn't name. It was the guilt of a man who had screamed into the void and was terrified he was about to hear an answer. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. Elias paced the silent rooms of his house, a prisoner of his own making. The news from town was always the same. Sarah was getting weaker. Dr. Evans had called in specialists. They too were baffled. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Elias felt their collective fear aimed at him, a silent, unceasing accusation. His hardened disbelief began to fracture. Small, inexplicable things started to happen. One evening, as he sat staring at an empty wall, the house was suddenly filled with the overwhelming scent of roses. It was Maria's favorite scent, the one she cultivated in her garden. But the garden was long dead, overgrown with weeds. He searched the entire house, his heart pounding. There were no flowers. The scent was everywhere and nowhere. It lingered for an hour, then vanished as mysteriously as it had come. A few nights later, he was jolted awake by a sound. It was the faint, clear tolling of a bell. He recognized it instantly. It was the old bell from St. Jude's, the one that hadn't been rung in over a decade because of a crack in its bronze casing. He went to the window and listened. It rang 7 times, each note hanging in the still night air with perfect clarity before falling silent. The next day, he asked the grocer about it. The man looked at him strangely. The bell had not been rung. No one had heard a thing. He started seeing things, too. Flickers of soft, blue light at the periphery of his vision, like the trail of a firefly. But there were no fireflies. It was as if the world he knew, the solid, predictable world of wood and nails and stone, was starting to fray at the edges. His skepticism, once a mighty fortress, was being worn down by a tide of gentle, persistent mystery. He felt like he was losing his mind. He wondered if this was his punishment, not a bolt of lightning, but a slow, quiet unraveling of his sanity. The pressure mounted until it was unbearable. Sarah Miller was now being kept alive by machines. The town had organized a prayer vigil. Elias watched from his window as a small procession of people walked towards the church, their faces grim, their shoulders slumped. They were turning to the very faith he had so violently rejected. And he, the source of this dark turn, was utterly and completely alone. That night, he didn't drink. He simply sat in the darkness, hollowed out and exhausted. Sleep, when it finally came, was not a release. It was a fall. He plunged into a darkness deeper than any he had ever known, a silence so complete it felt like the end of all things. There was no fear, only a profound sense of being lost. Then, a light began to grow. It was not a harsh light, but a soft, gentle luminescence, the color of a twilight sky. It coalesced before him, taking a shape, a form that he knew with a terror and an awe that rooted him to the spot. It was her, the woman from the statue. She stood before him in the void, not as a queen of heaven, but as a mother. She was beautiful, but her beauty was steeped in sorrow. And her face bore the very cracks he had inflicted on her stone likeness. Fine, web-like lines traced across her cheek and brow, not as flaws, but as evidence of a wound. Her hands were held out towards him, and one of them was missing, just as he had shattered it. Elias braced himself for judgment. He expected a tirade of celestial anger, a condemnation that would echo through eternity. He deserved it. He had invited it. He closed his eyes, waiting for the blow. But it never came. Instead, a voice entered his mind. It was not a sound that traveled through the air, but a thought, a feeling that bloomed directly in the center of his soul. It was a voice of impossible tenderness, a voice that held the sorrow of the entire world. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a compassion so deep it was painful to behold. And then she spoke the words that would shatter him far more completely than he had ever shattered her. "Forgive me," the voice pleaded in his heart. "Forgive me, my son, for not being able to take away your pain." The request was so stunning, so contrary to everything he had expected, that it broke through every wall he had ever built. He had vandalized her image, cursed her name, blamed her for the deepest wound of his life. And her response was not to demand an apology from him, but to offer one. She was apologizing for the nature of a world where good people suffered, where love was finite, and where grief was a price that had to be paid. She was weeping with him, not for her brokenness, but for his. The divine sorrow washed over him, and in its wake, it carried away the years of bitterness, the rage, the pride. He saw his own pain not as an injustice inflicted upon him, but as a part of a much larger, more mysterious tapestry of suffering and grace. He saw that his anger had been a shield, protecting him from a grief so vast he feared it would annihilate him. He fell to his knees in the dream space, and a single word escaped his lips, a word that was half sob, half prayer. "No," he whispered. And then he woke up. He awoke with a violent gasp, his body drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The dream was already fading, but the feeling of it, the overwhelming sense of being seen and loved and forgiven, remained. It filled the room, a presence more real than the bed he was lying in. The anger was gone. The hard knot of resentment in his chest had dissolved. In its place was an ache, but it was a clean ache, the ache of a wound that has finally been lanced and allowed to heal. He sat up, the morning light filtering through the dusty window, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't see the emptiness of the room. He felt a profound sense of peace. He began to weep. He wept for Maria, for his own blindness, for the child, Sarah, who was suffering. But these were not the tears of rage or self-pity. They were tears of pure, unadulterated grief and gratitude, mingled together. He was broken, but he felt whole. His body moved before his mind had fully caught up. He got out of bed, his legs unsteady. He went to Maria's old cedar chest, the one he hadn't opened since she died. He lifted the lid, and the scent of lavender and memories washed over him. He reached inside, and his fingers closed around her rosary. It was a simple thing, made of dark, smooth wood, the cross worn smooth by the touch of her hands. He clutched it like a lifeline. He did not go to the church. He did not go to the town square. He walked, drawn by an invisible thread, back to the scene of his crime. He walked back to the grotto. In the cool, gray light of dawn, the broken statue looked even more pathetic, a casualty of a war fought within one man's soul. Without a moment's hesitation, Elias fell to his knees on the damp earth. The sharp edges of the broken stone bit into his trousers, but he didn't notice. He began to gather the pieces. He picked up the fragments of the shattered hand, the slivers of the broken face, his calloused fingers moving with a surgeon's care. He wasn't trying to fix it. He was performing an act of repentance. It was a prayer made of action, not words. He didn't know how long he had been kneeling there when a soft voice spoke behind him. The smallest pieces are the hardest to find. He turned to see Sister Agnes. She held a small dustpan and brush. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a quiet understanding. She knelt beside him, her old bones creaking, and began to help. They worked in silence, two disparate souls united in a shared purpose of restoration. And as they worked, a continent away in the sterile, beeping world of a hospital room, a miracle was unfolding. Sarah Miller's mother, who had been keeping vigil for days, saw her daughter's eyelids flutter. The child's breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, suddenly deepened. She opened her eyes. The feverish glaze was gone. They were clear, blue, and aware. She looked at her mother and whispered a single word. "Mommy." Dr. Evans was summoned. He rushed into the room, his face a mask of disbelief. He checked her vitals. Her temperature was normal. Her heart rate was steady. He shone a light in her eyes. She was responsive. There was no medical explanation. The fever that had baffled 3 specialists had simply vanished. It was as if a storm had passed as suddenly as it had arrived. News of Sarah's recovery traveled through Havenwood with the speed of light. It was a jolt of electricity to the town's dormant heart. It started as a rumor, then a confirmation, then a joyous proclamation. When the story of the doctor's bafflement became known, people looked at each other with a dawning sense of wonder. Later that day, a few townspeople, drawn by curiosity, made their way to the grotto. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. Elias Vance, the town pariah, was on his knees, working alongside Sister Agnes. They were carefully fitting the broken pieces of the statue back together, using a small tub of mortar the sister had brought from the church basement. The sight was so unexpected, so deeply moving, that it silenced all gossip. They weren't just fixing a statue, they were mending something deeper. One by one, others joined them. The baker, Sarah's father, arrived with tears of gratitude streaming down his face. He didn't say a word to Elias. He simply picked up a cloth and began to gently clean the grime from the stone fragments. The skeptical grocer came, and then the mayor. They brought water, tools, and quiet encouragement. The act of restoring the statue became a communal sacrament. It was a public witness to a private transformation, and in that shared act, the community itself began to heal. Elias was no longer the angry recluse. He worked quietly, his movements full of a humility that was more powerful than any sermon. He didn't speak of his dream, not yet. He just worked, his hands, which had once destroyed, now dedicated to rebuilding. He felt the town's silent forgiveness surround him, a grace he knew he didn't deserve but accepted with a grateful heart. In the years that followed, Elias Vance became a different man. He was quiet, gentle, and always available. He didn't preach from a pulpit, but his life became a testament. When people asked him what had changed him, he would tell them his story, simply and without embellishment. He told them of his anger, his act of destruction, and the dream of a mother who had asked for his forgiveness. He became a pillar of the community, not through great deeds, but through small, consistent acts of service. He was a mender of fences, a listener of sorrows, a carrier of groceries for the elderly. The town of Havenwood was reborn. The grotto became a cherished place, a touchstone for the community's renewed faith. The church, which had been half empty for years, saw its pews begin to fill again. Neighbors started talking to each other again, not about the weather, but about their lives. A spirit of forgiveness and mutual support bloomed in the once fallow ground of their town. And the statue? It was never perfectly restored. Elias and the townspeople made a deliberate choice. They pieced it back together, but they left the cracks. The web of gray mortar lines remained visible across her face and her reattached hand. The scars were not hidden. They were honored. The statue stood not as a symbol of untouchable perfection, but as a testament to the fact that even the most broken things can be made whole again, and that true beauty often lies in the loving repair of what was shattered. It was a permanent reminder of a man's broken heart, a town's broken faith, and the divine love that had been merciful enough to mend them both.